"She's a fraud. She's not even family," my aunt cheered to the flashing cameras, proudly waving a fabricated DNA test to steal my grandfather's legacy. I calmly adjusted my microphone. "You're right," I replied. "I'm his sole creditor, and I just foreclosed on everything you own." Have you ever had a family member try to tear you down out of pure jealousy or greed? Tell me your story in the comments below, and please make sure to subscribe if you believe the truth always comes to light. But before the cameras flashed and our family was torn apart on live television, there was only a quiet, grieving house. It all started in the one place I felt safest. The scent of aged leather and sandalwood still lingered in Grandfather's office, untouched since the day he passed. I stood in the doorway, my fingers gripping the brass handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. For 25 years, this room had been my sanctuary. Grandfather, the formidable founder of the Vanguard Media empire, had always made time for me, his youngest granddaughter. We spent hours discussing broadcast strategies and journalistic integrity, but today, the room felt agonizingly hollow. "You shouldn't be in here," a sharp voice cut through my grief. I turned to see Aunt Clara, her posture rigid, her eyes lacking any trace of the mourning I felt. She was already wearing a tailored power suit, a stark contrast to my somber black dress. "I was just remembering him," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Memories don't run a $200 million company," Clara replied, stepping past me to run her manicured hand along the mahogany desk. "And frankly, the board is looking for strong, direct leadership, not sentimentality." Her words stung, a subtle but deliberate dismissal of my place in this family. Clara had always viewed me as an afterthought, an inconvenience in her grand design for succession. When Grandfather was alive, he shielded me from her sharp edges. Now I was entirely exposed to her ambition. I swallowed the lump in my throat, refusing to let her see my tears. "We haven't even laid him to rest yet, Aunt Clara." "The world doesn't stop for our grief," she said, her gaze fixing on me with an unsettling coldness. "Changes are coming. You'd do well to prepare yourself." As she ushered me out and locked the door behind us, a heavy dread settled in my chest. The days following the funeral were a blur of forced pleasantries and silent tears, but the shift in the household dynamics was undeniable. Clara moved into the main estate with an air of absolute authority. The family dinners, once filled with Grandfather's booming laughter, morphed into tense, quiet affairs where I was pointedly ignored. It started with the small things. My usual seat at the dining table was given to Clara's executive assistant. My name was conveniently omitted from the internal company memos regarding the transition period. The emotional isolation was suffocating, a heavy blanket of exclusion woven by my own aunt. "Did you receive the brief for tomorrow's board meeting?" I asked her one evening, trying to bridge the growing chasm between us. Clara didn't even look up from her tablet. "That meeting is for key stakeholders and legitimate family members only. There's no need for you to trouble yourself with grown-up matters." "I've sat in on those meetings for the last 3 years, I reminded her, trying to keep the tremor of hurt out of my voice. "Grandfather wanted me there." "My father," she emphasized the word my, "was a sentimental old man in his final years. His judgment was clouded by his misguided affection for you. But I am not burdened by such weaknesses." I retreated to my room that night, the sting of her words echoing in my mind. I wasn't just losing my grandfather, I was being systematically erased from the family I loved. I looked at the framed photo of Grandfather and me on my nightstand. He had always told me to be strong, to know my own worth when others tried to diminish it. Clara thought she was breaking me, but she was only awakening my resolve. While Clara spent her days restructuring the executive suite and hosting lavish lunches for the board of directors, I spent my nights in the quiet solitude of my study, going through my private financial servers. The Vanguard Media empire was a colossal entity, boasting a valuation of $200 million. To the public, it was an unstoppable juggernaut. To Clara, it was a glittering prize. But grandfather and I shared a secret. 5 years ago, the company had secretly hemorrhaged money due to a catastrophic digital expansion failure. Traditional banks had refused to lend to a legacy media company in rapid decline. Grandfather had been devastated, facing the prospect of dismantling his life's work. That was when I stepped in. Unbeknownst to the family, the modest tech startup I had founded in college had quietly blossomed into a massive venture capital firm. I couldn't bear to see grandfather's legacy crumble. Through a series of blind trusts and shell corporations, I became Vanguard's silent savior. I bought up their toxic debt and issued a massive, privately held line of credit that kept the lights on. I stared at the glowing monitors, the digital ledgers reflecting the absolute truth. I didn't just hold equity in Vanguard Media, I held its very lifeblood. The debt was tied to a strict covenant. As long as grandfather was at the helm, the terms were lenient. Upon his passing, the master note became callable at my discretion. Clara was fighting for a crown, entirely unaware that I owned the castle. The emotional weight of carrying this secret was heavy, especially as I watched my aunt parade her entitlement. But I promised grandfather I would protect the company from vultures. I just never expected the vulture to be his own daughter. The sprawling hallways of the family estate had always felt warm, but lately they felt like a labyrinth of secrets. It was late Tuesday afternoon when I walked past the conservatory, intending to grab a book I had left on the patio. The heavy oak doors were slightly ajar, and Clara's voice, hushed but terribly urgent, drifted out into the corridor. "I don't care how much it costs, just make it look authentic," Clara was saying. I froze, pressing my back against the cool plaster wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. A man's voice replied, gravelly and low, "Fabricating a DNA test is risky. If the board demands an independent verification—" "They won't," Clara interrupted smoothly. "I control the narrative. Vanguard is a media company, remember? Once I broadcast this, the public outrage will do the rest. She won't have the credibility to fight back. We just need a plausible piece of paper that proves she's not of my father's blood." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, a profound sorrow washing over me. It wasn't about the money, it was the sheer cruelty of her plan. She wasn't just trying to take the company, she was trying to strip away my identity, my history, and my belonging in this family. She wanted to invalidate the love grandfather and I shared by branding me a fraud. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle a sob. How had we come to this? Clara's greed had completely eclipsed her humanity. I slowly backed away, my footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could. As I retreated to my room, the tears finally fell. The woman I had called Aunt was plotting to destroy me on live television. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly toxic over the next 2 weeks. Clara's confidence swelled into blatant arrogance. She began moving my belongings out of the main living areas, boxing up the antique vases grandfather had bought for me, and replacing them with cold modern art. Every action was a calculated push, an emotional test to see if I would finally break. I endured it in silence. I smiled politely at the board members, who now looked at me with thinly veiled pity or outright disdain, clearly poisoned by Clara's subtle whispers. My silence wasn't weakness, it was an agonizing exercise in restraint. Every time she made a passive-aggressive comment about true lineage or family blood, my heart ached for the family we could have been. "You're awfully quiet these days," Clara remarked one morning over coffee. She was flipping through a press release draft, looking immensely pleased with herself. "Accepting your place, finally?" "I am simply observing, Aunt Clara," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Good. It's best you stay out of the way, she sneered, taking a delicate sip from her porcelain cup. Next week, I'll be making a major public announcement regarding the future leadership of Vanguard. It will be a cleansing of sorts for the company image. I knew exactly what she was planning. The fake DNA test, the public humiliation, the grand theft of grandfather's legacy. I looked down at my hands, resting quietly in my lap. My lawyers had finalized the foreclosure documents the night before. Everything was perfectly in place. The emotional toll of knowing what was about to happen to her was immense, yet unavoidable. I look forward to your announcement, I said softly, and I truly meant it. The morning of the press conference broke with a dreary, gray sky, perfectly mirroring the heaviness in my chest. I stood before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, buttoning a simple navy blue blazer. It was the same blazer grandfather had bought me when I negotiated my very first business contract. To remind you of your quiet strength, he had said, his eyes crinkling with pride. I traced the lapel with trembling fingers. I missed him so much it physically hurt. Downstairs, the house was buzzing with chaotic energy. Clara had hired a team of publicists, makeup artists, and stylists to ensure she looked the part of a grieving yet resolute visionary. I could hear her sharp laughter echoing up the stairwell, devoid of any genuine sorrow. She was celebrating her impending coronation, entirely unaware of the storm she had summoned. I took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to ruin my composure. This wasn't just about money or a company. It was about the utter destruction of my family. Clara was willing to publicly disown me, to erase my 25 years of love and loyalty, simply to feed her ego. The emotional weight of knowing I had to publicly destroy my only remaining relative to save grandfather's legacy was a crushing burden. I picked up the thick, leather-bound portfolio containing the foreclosure documents and slipped it into my briefcase. It felt like carrying a loaded weapon. I didn't want to use it. I had spent countless nights praying that Clara would change her mind, that she would remember we were blood, that she would choose family over power. But as I walked down the stairs to face her, I knew those prayers had gone unanswered. The green room at the Vanguard Media headquarters was suffocatingly tense. Clara sat before a brightly lit vanity mirror, humming softly as a makeup artist powdered her cheekbones. I stood near the door, clutching my briefcase to my chest like a shield. I looked at her reflection, searching for any trace of the aunt who used to read me bedtime stories when I was a child. "Aunt Clara," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "Can we talk? Just for a moment, in private." She waved the makeup artist away with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Make it quick. I have a broadcast in 10 minutes, and the entire financial sector is watching." I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "We don't have to do this. We can run Vanguard together. Grandfather left a legacy for both of us to protect. If you go out there and do what you're planning to do, there is no coming back from it. It will break this family forever." Clara turned her chair slowly, her eyes sweeping over me with absolute disdain. There was no warmth, no hesitation, only a cold, calculating ambition. "This family was broken the day my father decided to play favorites with you," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You are a parasite, clinging to a legacy that belongs solely to me. I am simply excising the infection. By noon, the world will know exactly what you are." My last ounce of hope withered and died right there in the green room. I had offered her an olive branch, a final chance at redemption and unity. She had snapped it in half. I nodded slowly, the sadness settling deep in my bones. "I understand," I whispered. "Good luck, Clara." The main atrium of the Vanguard building had been transformed into a sprawling media circus. Rows of folding chairs were packed with journalists from every major network and financial publication. Camera flashes fired in rapid succession like a strobe light, illuminating the massive Vanguard logo suspended above the stage. I was instructed by Clara's security team to stand at the far edge of the stage, positioned perfectly for the cameras to capture my face when she delivered her devastating blow. I stood tall, my hands clasped in front of me, enduring the curious stares and hushed whispers of the reporters. They knew a scandal was brewing. They could smell it in the air. The emotional isolation I felt in that room was profound. I was surrounded by hundreds of people, yet I had never felt so utterly alone. Grandfather used to hold my hand when we faced the press, giving it a reassuring squeeze to let me know we were a team. Now my hands were empty, cold, and trembling. A hush fell over the atrium as the heavy velvet curtains parted. Aunt Clara strode onto the stage, bathed in the glaring spotlight. She wore a perfectly tailored white suit, projecting an image of purity and absolute control. The room erupted into a frenzy of camera shutters and shouted questions, but she simply raised a hand, demanding total silence. She walked to the podium, arranged her notes, and looked out at the sea of reporters. Then she turned her head and looked directly at me. Her smile was chilling, a triumphant, predatory grin. The public execution of my identity was about to begin, and she was going to savor every single second of it. "Thank you all for being here," Clara began, her voice echoing through the PA system, thick with rehearsed sorrow. "The passing of my father was a tragedy, but Vanguard Media must look to the future, and to do that, we must ensure that our foundation is built on truth, integrity, and true family legacy." The reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Clara's voice hardened, taking on a theatrical edge of righteous indignation. "For years, my father's generosity was exploited. He took in a girl, raised her, and loved her, but his declining mental state blinded him to a painful truth." She reached into her blazer and dramatically pulled out a sealed manila envelope. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. The moment she had orchestrated to ruin me. "I have here an independent, medically verified DNA test," Clara announced, holding the document high above her head for the cameras to capture. "It proves unequivocally that the woman standing on this stage, the woman who has claimed a right to this empire, shares zero biological connection to my father." Gasps rippled through the audience. A dozen cameras pivoted to capture my reaction. Clara pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me, her voice reaching a crescendo of theatrical outrage. "She is a fraud. She manipulated an old man for his fortune. She's not even family," she cheered, dropping the grieving daughter act entirely. A triumphant, vicious laugh escaped her lips as the room erupted into chaos, reporters shouting questions over one another. She had done it. She had publicly stripped me of my grandfather, my history, and my home. The noise in the room was deafening, a tidal wave of shouted questions and blinding flashes. Clara stood at the podium, basking in the chaotic glory of her perceived victory, her chest heaving with excitement. She looked at me, expecting to see a broken, sobbing girl fleeing the stage in disgrace. Instead, I felt an eerie, absolute calm wash over me. The sadness was gone, replaced by the steely resolve grandfather had spent 25 years instilling in me. I unclasped my hands, picked up my heavy briefcase, and walked slowly toward the center of the stage. The reporters felt dead silent as I approached the podium. Clara stepped back, her triumphant smile faltering slightly at my unwavering composure. I calmly adjusted the microphone, leaning in so my voice would carry over the silent atrium. "You're right," I replied, my voice steady, echoing crystal clear through the speakers. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legally bound, notarized financial documents. I held them up, mirroring her earlier gesture, but these papers carried the weight of absolute reality. "I'm not family," I continued, turning to look Clara directly in the eyes. Her face began to drain of color. "I'm his sole creditor. 5 years ago, I bought Vanguard's toxic debt to save it from bankruptcy. The terms were tied strictly to my grandfather's tenure." I turned back to the sea of stunned reporters. "And as of midnight last night, upon the default triggered by his passing, I formally foreclosed on this entire company. Vanguard Media, the building we are standing in, and every asset attached to it, now belongs entirely to my venture capital firm." I looked back at Clara, whose white suit suddenly seemed to swallow her hollow, shaking frame. "Please," I said softly, my voice devoid of malice, only carrying the heavy burden of the truth. "Keep smiling for the news." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air from the massive atrium. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one moved. Even the camera shutters ceased. Aunt Clara stared at the stack of documents in my hand as if they were a venomous snake, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Then the room exploded. It was a chaotic symphony of shouting journalists, flashing lights, and frantic producers barking into their headsets. The narrative had flipped in an instant. Clara was no longer the tragic heroine protecting her family's legacy. She was the usurped queen who had just lost her entire kingdom on live television. "This is a lie!" Clara finally shrieked, her voice cracking over the microphone. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers from my grasp. "She forged these. It's a pathetic bluff." I stepped back gracefully, handing the thick binder to Mr. Sterling, the head of Vanguard's legal department, who had rushed the stage. He adjusted his glasses, flipping through the notarized pages, the official bank seals, and the unmistakable signature of my late grandfather. I watched Mr. Sterling's face drain of color as the reality of my words sank in. "Clara?" Mr. Sterling said softly, stepping between us and shielding the microphone. "These are legitimate. The default clauses are ironclad. The holding company belongs to her." Clara stumbled backward, her pristine white suit suddenly looking far too big for her shrinking posture. The triumphant sneer she had worn just moments ago melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The cameras captured every millimeter of her downfall, broadcasting her devastating realization to the world. I had won, but my heart felt heavier than ever. Within the hour, the media had been corralled out of the building, and the suffocating tension had relocated to the executive boardroom. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, the seat grandfather had occupied for decades. Clara sat opposite me, flanked by her 2 highest-paid attorneys. "There has to be a loophole," Clara snapped, her voice trembling with a mixture of panic and exhaustion. She looked at her lawyers, desperate for a lifeline. "My father would never sign over the entire media group as collateral. He wouldn't do that to me." "He didn't do it to hurt you, Aunt Clara," I said quietly, the anger draining out of me, leaving only a profound sadness. "He did it to save Vanguard. 5 years ago, the company was hemorrhaging capital. No bank would touch us. If I hadn't stepped in through my venture firm, Vanguard would have been liquidated, and you would have lost everything anyway." Her lead attorney, a stern man named Harrison, closed his leather folder with a definitive thud. "Ms. Vanguard is correct, Clara. We've reviewed the master note." The debt was immense, and the failure to repay upon the trigger event, your father's passing, allows for an immediate asset seizure. She legally owns the company, the subsidiaries, and the primary estate, which was tied to the corporate trust. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "The estate? My home?" "Everything," I confirmed, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to hurt her, but the boundaries had to be drawn. Your relentless pursuit of power blinded you to the actual mechanics of this company. You built your entire identity around a paper castle, Clara, and today the wind finally blew it down. By late afternoon, the building had emptied. The board had been formally dissolved and reconstituted under my holding company, and the transition team was already drafting the new corporate structure. I walked slowly into Grandfather's office and closed the heavy oak door behind me, finally alone for the first time since the morning's chaos. I sank into his worn leather chair and buried my face in my hands. There was no joy in this victory. I had successfully protected Vanguard Media, just as I had promised Grandfather I would, but the cost was astronomical. The public humiliation of my only remaining aunt was a heavy burden on my conscience. I had stripped her of her pride, her home, and her illusions of grandeur. I looked up at the oil painting of Grandfather hanging behind the desk. His kind eyes seemed to gaze down at me, offering a silent comfort. I did what I had to do, I whispered to the empty room, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes and tracing hot paths down my cheeks. But I miss you. I miss our family. The power I now held felt cold and isolating. I had an empire at my fingertips, but I would have traded every single share, every dollar, and every executive title just to sit on the porch with Grandfather and Clara, eating Sunday breakfast like we used to when I was a little girl. Greed had poisoned our bloodline, and though I held the antidote, the healing process was going to be excruciating. I drove back to the family estate that evening. The sprawling mansion, once a beacon of warmth and childhood memories, felt like a mausoleum. Moving boxes were already stacked in the grand foyer. I found Clara in the master suite, furiously throwing designer clothes into a leather suitcase. Her makeup was smudged, and the flawless facade she had maintained for years was completely shattered. When she saw me standing in the doorway, she froze, a bitter resentment burning in her eyes. "Have you come to gloat?" she spat, her voice thick with unshed tears. "To watch the guards throw me out onto the street?" "No," I replied softly, stepping into the room. "I came to tell you that you don't have to leave tonight. You can stay in the guest house for as long as you need to figure things out. I'm transferring a modest living stipend into your personal account, so you won't be stranded." Clara let out a harsh, broken laugh. "Charity? From the girl I just tried to disown on national television? Don't insult me." "It's not charity, Aunt Clara. It's grace," I said, my voice steady but gentle. "You tried to destroy me because you thought power was the only thing that mattered. I'm trying to show you that family matters more, even after everything." She turned away from me, her shoulders shaking as she gripped the edges of her suitcase. She couldn't bring herself to look at me, perhaps because looking at me meant facing the magnitude of her own cruelty. I quietly left the room, giving her the dignity of falling apart in private. The bridge between us was burned to ashes, but I was determined to leave the stones intact. The next morning, returning to Grandfather's office to begin my tenure as CEO, I faced the arduous task of cleaning out his personal desk. It felt invasive, sifting through his reading glasses, old fountain pens, and handwritten notes. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old leather-bound journals, I found a small sealed envelope. My name and Clara's name were written on the front in Grandfather's elegant cursive. My breath hitched. With trembling hands, I broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick parchment. "My dearest girls, if you are reading this together, it means my prayers were answered. If you are reading this divided, it means my greatest fears have come to pass. Clara, my brilliant daughter, your ambition is a fire that I fear will one day burn you alive. You have let pride blind you to the love right in front of you. And my sweet granddaughter, your quiet strength is the only water that can extinguish that destructive flame. I knew of Clara's resentment, and I knew of the secret debt you bought to save us. I orchestrated nothing, but I foresaw everything. Vanguard is a test. Clara, if you lost the company, I pray it strips away your ego so you can finally see your own worth outside of a boardroom. And my dear granddaughter, I pray you have the mercy to forgive her when she falls. A company is just bricks and ink. You too are my legacy. Fix this, together. With all my love, Dad/Grandpa. Tears blurred my vision as I traced his signature. He had known. He had always known. The emotional weight of his dying wish settled over me, illuminating the long, difficult path ahead. The walk from the main estate to the guest house felt longer than it ever had before. The midday sun offered no warmth, only a stark illumination of the newly drawn boundaries within our home. I clutched Grandfather's letter in my hand, the thick parchment feeling like an anchor weighing me down, yet keeping me grounded. I knocked softly on the heavy oak door. For a long time, there was no answer. I knocked again, firmer this time. "The door is unlocked," a raspy voice called out. I stepped inside. The guest house was luxurious, but compared to the sweeping grandeur of the main mansion, it felt intensely isolating. Clara was sitting in an armchair by the unlit fireplace, wrapped in a simple cashmere shawl. She looked smaller, stripped of her designer armor and boardroom bravado. "What do you want?" she asked, not meeting my eyes. "Haven't you taken enough?" "I didn't come to take anything," I replied softly, crossing the room to stand near her. "I came to give you this." I held out the letter. She looked at it suspiciously, noting Grandfather's elegant handwriting on the envelope. Her breath hitched. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she took the letter and began to read. I watched as her eyes darted across the page. The rigid set of her jaw trembled. The wall of anger and entitlement she had built around herself finally cracked. A single tear spilled down her cheek, followed by another, until she was weeping silently into her hands. It was the first time I had ever seen my aunt truly cry. "He knew," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He knew how ugly my heart had become. He also knew it could heal," I reminded her. I didn't hug her. We weren't there yet. But I left the letter in her lap and quietly walked out, leaving her to mourn the father she had lost and the daughter she had forgotten how to be. Monday morning arrived with a brutal swiftness. Stepping into the Vanguard Media boardroom as the undisputed owner was a surreal experience. The heavy mahogany table, once a battleground of passive-aggressive slights directed at me, was now surrounded by executives who hung on to my every word. "As you can see from the revised financial packets," our CFO, David, stammered nervously, "the transition of assets to your venture firm is complete. We await your strategic directives, ma'am." I looked around the room. The sycophantic nods and nervous smiles made my stomach turn. Just weeks ago, these same people had watched Clara systematically erase me, offering no objections. They were loyal only to power. "My directive is stability," I said, keeping my voice firm and authoritative. "The public scandal has damaged our credibility. We need to focus on our core journalistic integrity. No layoffs, no major restructuring for the next quarter. We put our heads down and we do the work." The relief in the room was palpable. I had spared their jobs, but I had no illusions about their loyalty. Sitting in Grandfather's chair later that afternoon, the immense pressure of the crown finally settled on my shoulders. I was a tech venture capitalist, accustomed to the fast-paced, silent world of coding and quiet acquisitions. Running a massive, public-facing legacy media empire was an entirely different beast. I looked at the massive stacks of contracts, sponsorship renewals, and editorial disputes piled on my desk. Grandfather used to navigate this with effortless grace. Clara had spent 20 years learning the intricate nuances of these specific accounts. I was flying blind, entirely alone at the top of the world. The weeks turned into a month, and a strange, fragile routine settled over the estate. I ran Vanguard during the day, drowning in a sea of corporate responsibilities, and returned to the cavernous, empty mansion at night. Clara rarely left the guest house. Through the kitchen windows, I would occasionally see her walking through the gardens in the early morning mist. The frenetic, ambitious woman who had demanded the world's attention was entirely gone, replaced by a ghost haunting the edges of her former kingdom. One rainy Tuesday evening, I noticed the grocery delivery service hadn't arrived for the guest house. Clara's stipend was more than enough, but perhaps she simply hadn't ordered anything. The thought of her sitting alone, hungry in the dark, tugged painfully at my conscience. I packed a basket with fresh bread, roasted chicken, and a jar of the blackberry preserve she used to love when I was a child. I walked through the downpour, shielding the basket with an umbrella. I left it on her porch, knocked twice, and began to walk away. The door creaked open. "You don't have to do this," Clara's voice called out over the rain. I stopped and turned around. She was standing in the doorway, looking at the basket with a complicated expression of shame and gratitude. "I know," I said gently, "but it's getting cold, and you need to eat." She wrapped her arms around herself, nodding slowly. "Thank you." It was a microscopic exchange, 2 words spoken in the rain, but it was the very first bridge built across the chasm of our ruined relationship. I walked back to the main house, feeling a tiny, fragile spark of hope. The fragile peace was shattered on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of a budgeting meeting when my assistant rushed in, her face pale. "It's the Sterling Foundation," she whispered urgently. "They're pulling their annual media sponsorship." My heart plummeted. The Sterling Foundation was Vanguard's oldest and most prestigious backer. Their endorsement was the bedrock of our public credibility. Losing them would trigger a domino effect, causing other advertisers to jump ship. I immediately called Richard Sterling, the foundation's stern patriarch. "I'm sorry," Richard said over the phone, his tone uncompromising. "But Vanguard is not the company it was under your grandfather. The spectacle, the public family feud. It violates our core values. We cannot associate our philanthropic efforts with such a circus." "Mr. Sterling, please," I pleaded, fighting the panic rising in my chest. "The company is stable. I am honoring my grandfather's vision." "You are a venture capitalist, my dear," he replied coldly. "You understand money, but you do not understand the decades of personal history that built Vanguard." "Clara understood it. Your grandfather understood it. I'm afraid our decision is final." He hung up, leaving me staring blankly at the dial tone. He was right. I didn't know the history. I didn't know the inside jokes, the decades of shared dinners, or the emotional nuances that kept these legacy sponsors tied to Vanguard. I had the legal ownership, but I lacked the institutional memory. There was only one person alive who knew how to speak Richard Sterling's language. I closed my eyes, swallowing my pride. I knew exactly what I had to do, and it terrified me. I drove home faster than usual, the urgency of the crisis pushing aside my hesitation. I didn't bother knocking on the guest house door. I rang the bell continuously until Clara opened it, looking alarmed. "What's wrong?" she asked, seeing the panic on my face. "Richard Sterling is pulling the foundation's sponsorship," I said breathlessly, stepping out of the cold. "He's officially dropping Vanguard. If he leaves, 3 other major networks will follow by Monday. The company will survive, but its reputation will be gutted." Clara's eyes widened, the old sharp business acumen instantly flashing across her face. "Richard, no, he can't. He signed a verbal memorandum with my father just before he died. It was binding in principle." "He doesn't care about the principle," I admitted, my voice dropping. "He cares about the scandal. He said I don't understand the history. He said you did." Clara fell silent, staring at me. The power dynamic had suddenly shifted. For the first time since the foreclosure, I genuinely needed her. I wasn't the victor gloating over the defeated. I was a drowning captain asking the mutineer for a life preserver. I can't fix this, I admitted, the vulnerability burning my throat. I don't know him like you do. I need your help, Aunt Clara. Vanguard needs your help. She looked away, conflicted. She could easily let me fail. It would validate her belief that I was unfit to lead. But as she looked at the framed photo of grandfather sitting on her side table, her expression softened. "Get your laptop," Clara said quietly, turning toward her dining table, "and tell me exactly what Richard said. We have a lot of work to do." The guest house transformed into a war room. For the first time in years, Clara and I were on the same side of a battlefield. We spent hours combing through digital archives, but Clara provided the context no computer ever could. "Richard doesn't care about our quarterly projections," Clara explained, pacing the floor with a mug of black coffee. "In 1998, his wife fell ill. My father halted all commercial broadcasts for 3 minutes across every Vanguard network to air a documentary about her specific illness, driving millions to their foundation. That is the debt of loyalty Richard honors," I typed furiously, weaving her historical knowledge into a new, comprehensive proposal. I watched her as she spoke. She was in her element, animated and brilliant. Without the toxic veil of absolute ambition clouding her judgment, I could finally see the brilliant businesswoman grandfather had raised. Around 2 in the morning, our eyes met over the glow of the laptop. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken apologies and years of built-up resentment. But in that small space, surrounded by scattered papers and cold coffee, the tension felt different. It wasn't combative, it was weary. "You're a fast typist," she murmured, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of her lips. "You have an incredible memory," I replied softly. It was a tiny concession, a microscopic acknowledgement of each other's worth. We worked until the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the room in hues of gold and pink. We had built a presentation that honored the past while securing the future. Now we just had to convince Richard Sterling that the Vanguard family was no longer at war. The Sterling Foundation headquarters was intimidating, a monolith of marble and glass. As we rode the elevator to the top floor, my palms were sweating. Clara stood beside me, wearing a subdued gray suit. She looked nervous, a stark contrast to the arrogant woman who had taken the stage weeks ago. "We can do this," I whispered, reaching out to gently touch her arm. She looked at my hand, then up at me, giving a slow, affirming nod. When we walked into Richard Sterling's sprawling office, the elderly billionaire looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing in profound confusion. He expected me to walk in alone, a desperate tech executive begging for a handout. Seeing Clara beside me, calm and collected, completely derailed his expectations. "Clara," Richard said, his voice laced with suspicion, "I must admit I did not expect to see you here, given the public nature of your recent departure. I am here because Vanguard is more important than my personal pride, Richard," Clara said, stepping forward with a quiet dignity I had never seen her possess. "My niece and I have had our profound differences. But we share a profound love for the legacy my father built, and we are here to protect it, together." I opened my briefcase and laid the proposal on his desk. "Mr. Sterling," I began, my voice steady, "I bring the financial security to ensure Vanguard thrives for the next 50 years. But Clara brings the heart, the history, and the institutional memory that made you trust us in the first place." "We are a united front." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers as he looked between the two of us. The room felt perfectly silent. For a long, agonizing moment, Richard Sterling simply studied the proposal without opening it. His sharp eyes darted between Clara and me, searching for any fracture in our united facade. He was a man who built his empire on reading people, and he was searching for the lie. "The spectacle your family put on was embarrassing," Richard finally said, his voice low and gravelly. It insulted the memory of a man I considered a dear friend. I told you yesterday that I do not associate with broken homes. We were broken, Richard, Clara admitted, her voice trembling slightly, yet maintaining its strength. My greed broke us. I lost sight of what my father truly valued. But the girl standing next to me, the girl I tried to destroy, had the grace to pick me up when I fell. If you want to honor my father, honor the fact that his family is finally healing. I looked at Clara, my heart swelling with an emotion I couldn't quite name. It was the most honest, vulnerable thing she had ever said. Richard slowly opened the folder. He skimmed the first page, noting the specific references to the 1998 charity drive Clara had insisted we include. A soft, barely perceptible smile touched his weathered face. Your grandfather was a stubborn, visionary fool, Richard sighed, closing the folder and pulling a gold pen from his pocket. It seems the apple hasn't fallen far from the tree for either of you. He signed the renewal memorandum and slid it across the desk. You have a 1-year probation. Do not make me regret this. As we walked out of the building and into the crisp morning air, Clara stopped. She turned to me, tears pooling in her eyes, and finally wrapped her arms around me. The drive back to the estate was peaceful. The heavy, suffocating cloud that had hung over our family for years had finally begun to dissipate. When we arrived, instead of retreating to the guest house, Clara followed me into the main kitchen. I put a kettle on the stove, the familiar whistle a comforting sound in the cavernous room. I poured 2 mugs of chamomile tea and slid one across the marble island to her. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, staring into the golden liquid. I never hated you, she whispered into the quiet room. I sat opposite her, giving her the space to speak. I hated how effortless it was for you to win his approval, she continued, a single tear sliding down her cheek. I spent my entire life trying to be the perfect corporate heir. I sacrificed marriages, friendships, everything, just to prove I was worthy of the Vanguard name. And then you came along, with your quiet intelligence and gentle heart, and he looked at you with a pride he never showed me. The emotional weight of her confession hit me hard. Her cruelty wasn't born of malice, but of a deep, unhealed wound of inadequacy. He was proud of you, Aunt Clara, I said softly, reaching across the island to cover her hand with mine. He was in awe of your strength, but he worried that your ambition would leave you isolated. He loved us differently, but he didn't love you less. Clara squeezed my hand, a sob catching in her throat. The walls were completely down. We sat there for a long time, crying over cooling tea, mourning the grandfather we lost, and weeping for the years we had wasted fighting a phantom war. The next morning, I called Clara into the executive boardroom. It was empty, save for the 2 of us. The atmosphere was light, a stark contrast to the oppressive tension of our previous encounters in this room. I've been reviewing the corporate structure, I said, handing her a freshly drafted contract. Clara looked at it hesitantly. I don't expect a handout. You won the company fair and square. It's not a handout, I corrected her kindly. It's an operational necessity. I am a venture capitalist. I know how to scale, acquire, and manage assets. But I don't know the soul of this company. I need someone who understands the legacy of Vanguard Media to manage our philanthropic efforts, public relations, and legacy sponsorships. Clara read the title at the top of the contract, President of Heritage and Strategic Partnerships. You would be an executive officer, I explained. You won't have unilateral control of the board, but you will be the public face of Vanguard's history. It's where your true brilliance lies, Clara. Not in the ruthless corporate takeovers, but in the relationships you've built over 20 years. She traced the embossed letters of her name on the document. I could see the battle in her eyes, the ghost of her old ego fighting the newfound humiliate. But the ghost lost. She picked up a pen and signed the document with a steady hand. Thank you, she said, looking up at me with clear, grateful eyes. I won't let you down. I know you won't. I smiled. We had a long road of rebuilding ahead of us, both for the company and our family. But as we walked out of the boardroom side by side, I knew Grandfather was looking down at us, finally at peace. The quarterly board meeting was the true test of our fragile peace. As Clara confidently took the seat to my right, the designated chair for the newly minted president of Heritage and Strategic Partnerships, a palpable ripple of unease washed over the executive team. Our chief financial officer, David, nervously tapped his pen against his leather portfolio, his eyes darting between us. "Madam CEO," David began, clearing his throat, "while we respect your executive authority, reintroducing Clara to the C-suite so soon after the public incident presents a significant optics risk. The shareholders value stability." I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the mahogany cable. "Stability, David, is built on a strong foundation, and Vanguard's foundation is its history." Before I could continue, Clara raised a hand, stepping into the fray with a calm, disarming humility that immediately commanded the room's attention. "David's concerns are entirely valid," Clara said, her voice steady and devoid of its old arrogance. "I breached the trust of this company, the public, and most importantly, my family. I am not here to reclaim a throne. I am here to serve the legacy my father built and to support the incredible vision our CEO brings to Vanguard's future." The board members exchanged bewildered glances. The vicious, power-hungry woman they had feared for decades had been replaced by a grounded, self-aware leader. "Clara recently secured a 5-year renewal from the Sterling Foundation," I added, letting that monumental victory hang in the air. "She knows the soul of our sponsors. I know the mechanics of our future. We operate as one. Any doubts regarding our unity end today." The nervous murmurs ceased. As we moved on to the quarterly projections, Clara subtly caught my eye and offered a warm, grateful smile. We had passed the test. Away from the glaring lights of the media empire, the deepest healing happened in the quiet dirt of the estate. Grandfather had meticulously maintained a sprawling rose garden behind the mansion, a place he claimed grounded him when the corporate world felt too heavy. For months after his death, the garden had grown wild and tangled. Early Saturday morning, I found Clara kneeling in the damp soil, wearing old gardening gloves and a simple straw hat. She was carefully pruning the deadwood from a massive, climbing white rose bush. "These were his favorites," I said softly, stepping onto the stone path so I wouldn't startle her. Clara paused, wiping a smudge of dirt from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "He called them the peacekeepers, said they required patience, precision, and a gentle hand to bloom properly. I think I finally understand what he meant." I knelt beside her, picking up a spare pair of shears to help clear the thorny debris. We worked in a comfortable, companionable silence, the only sounds being the snip of the shears and the distant chirping of morning birds. "I'm sorry I boxed up your antique vases," Clara suddenly whispered, her eyes fixed on the soil. "I was trying to erase your presence because seeing you reminded me of everything I wasn't. It was petty and it was cruel. I brought them back downstairs yesterday," I replied gently, placing a hand over her gloved fingers. "They look perfect on the mantel, right next to your silver tea set." She let out a soft, wet laugh, leaning her shoulder against mine. The thorns of our past had been sharp, but as we cleared the deadwood together, I knew our family was finally ready to bloom again. 6 months after the disastrous press conference that nearly destroyed us, the Vanguard atrium was once again packed with journalists and flashing cameras. The setting was identical, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. There was no tension, no scent of scandal, only genuine anticipation. I stood at the side of the stage, watching proudly as Aunt Clara walked to the podium. She wore a warm, tailored beige suit, her posture relaxed and welcoming. She didn't demand silence this time. She simply waited with a gentle smile until the room quieted down. "Welcome," Clara's voice echoed through the speakers, rich with genuine emotion. Half a year ago, I stood on this stage and made a terrible mistake, blinded by grief and pride. Today, I stand before you not to divide, but to build. She gestured toward the massive screen behind her, revealing the new logo for the Vanguard Memorial Foundation. My father built this empire to tell the truth, Clara continued. In his honor, we are launching a $50 million philanthropic initiative to fund independent investigative journalism and media literacy programs worldwide. And I could not have spearheaded this without the brilliant, steady leadership of our CEO and my beloved niece. The crowd erupted in applause. Clara turned and extended her hand to me. I walked onto the stage, the heavy isolation I had felt months prior completely, entirely gone. I took her hand, and she pulled me into a warm, genuine embrace in front of the world. The cameras captured the moment perfectly. Not a fractured empire, but a united family. She had publicly restored everything she had once tried to take away. The healing was complete, broadcasted for everyone to see. The guest house had served its purpose as both a purgatory and a sanctuary for Clara. But as the autumn leaves began to fall, its distance from the main estate felt increasingly unnecessary. The emotional chasm had closed, yet the physical boundary remained. One chilly evening, I walked up to the guest house carrying a stack of empty cardboard boxes. I knocked lightly and let myself in. Clara was at the dining table, reviewing grant proposals for the new foundation. She looked up, raising an eyebrow at the boxes. "Is there a leak in the main house?" "No," I smiled, setting the boxes down on the floor. "But the house is too quiet. The West Wing is entirely empty, and frankly, I miss having someone to argue with over the Sunday crossword puzzle." Clara stared at me, the pen slowly slipping from her fingers. "Are you sure? You own the estate. You don't have to share your space with me." "I own the bricks, Clara," I said, echoing grandfather's final letter. "But it's not a home without family in it. Your old suite is exactly how you left it. It's time to come back." Tears welled in her eyes, reflecting the soft glow of the table lamp. She stood up, walking around the table, and pulled me into a fierce, tight hug. The rigidity that had defined her entire adult life had completely melted away. "Thank you," she whispered against my shoulder, her voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Family doesn't give up," I replied, squeezing her back. We spent the rest of the night packing her clothes, laughing over old memories, and closing the door on the guest house for good. Sunday mornings at the Vanguard estate used to be grandfather's favorite time of the week. He would insist on a massive breakfast, filling the dining room with the scent of roasted coffee, warm scones, and bacon. For a long time after his passing, Sundays were unbearable reminders of our loss. But as sunlight streamed through the bay windows this morning, the dining room felt alive again. I sat at my usual place at the table, sipping tea and reading the morning financial briefs. Across from me, Clara was furiously erasing a mistake on her crossword puzzle, muttering softly to herself. "It's a 7-letter word for forgiveness," she grumbled, tapping her pencil against her chin. "Amnesty," I offered, without looking up from my tablet. "Show off," she chuckled, writing it down. I smiled, setting my tablet aside. I looked at the head of the table. Grandfather's heavy, carved wooden chair sat empty. It used to radiate a hollow, agonizing sadness. Now it simply felt like a monument to a life well lived. I had saved Vanguard Media from financial ruin, but the true victory was much closer to home. The $200 million empire was secure, but the real wealth was sitting across from me, laughing over a newspaper puzzle. We had survived the venom of greed and the perilous traps of pride. "Do we have that board dinner tomorrow night?" Clara asked, breaking my reverie. "We do," I nodded, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over my heart. "But today is just for us." Clara smiled warmly, lifting her coffee mug toward the empty chair at the head of the table in a silent, loving toast. "Just us," she agreed. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough.